Hi, I'm Kat, and today I have for you a phrase in Romanian, a true crime case, and also makeup. So today's phrase that I'm going to be translating is actually a request from Janet Hines, a long-time YouTube subscriber to my channel. So we can get started with translating the phrase. Să protejăm copiii. Să protejăm copiii. Să protejăm copiii. Well done, guys. You just said protect the children. You'll have to excuse my nails because I actually decided I'm gonna give them a break. So yeah, there you have it. Nails on a break. Mark Dean Schwab, born on December 16, 1968, was an American prisoner in the state of Florida, where he was executed for the April 18, 1991 rape and murder of 11-year-old Junny Rios-Martinez Sr. Mark was convicted of the crime in 1992 and he was sentenced to death. In addition, he received 2 life sentences. He was executed by lethal injection on July the 1st, 2008 and pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. Junny's parents were there watching him die. Junny's mom said that the execution procedure was very peaceful. His eyes shut, his jaw went limp, and he never woke up again. There was no suffering for him, and his death was nothing like her son's, Junny's death. So let's just get into all of the details. Junny Omar Rios-Martinez Jr. was born on 6th of May 1979 to his mother Vickie Rios-Martinez and his father Junny Rios-Martinez Sr. Junny lived with his parents in their home in Cocoa, Florida, with his 4-year-old sister Jayme and 6-year-old brother Jeremy. Now, fun fact about Cocoa, several stories go around as to how the town got its name. One story says that the mail used to come by river boat and was placed in an empty tin box labeled Baker's Cocoa. The box was nailed to a piling in the river next to downtown. Another story speaks of an elderly African-American woman who lived on the banks of the Indian River. She would supply hot cocoa to sailors crossing the Indian River. It was said that the sailors approaching her house would yell out, "Cocoa, cocoa," alerting the woman that they were there and wanted the drink. I personally like the second story better. Anyway, going back to Junny Rios-Martinez. Junny's father, a Puerto Rican musician, was known throughout Brevard County and music circles everywhere for his mastery behind the drum set and his love of playing the guitar. He played in the band The Killer Dudes. Junny's mother, Vickie, a mother of 6 children and grandmother to 12 grandchildren, found joy in planting, writing poetry and meditation. They are a large and loving family. Both Junny's parents having been married before and with children and grandchildren from their previous marriages. Junny Sr. and Vickie worked hard to achieve the American dream. They run a popular hair salon and Junny Sr. also works at the Parks Department and plays in a band. Junny Sr. learned how to be a father by watching his own father, a merchant marine in Puerto Rico for 38 years, who made sure every time he disembarked that everyone in his extended family was up to date in their bills and they had food on their tables. He was always Junny Sr.'s hero. He taught him the value of family every single day. Junny Jr. was described by those who knew him as a gentle soul, but he was also really determined. He loved surfing, the salt air, music and playing baseball. He had a really good soul. Junny was everybody's friend. He was outgoing, handsome and athletic. He was 5 feet tall and weighed 76 pounds. His picture appeared in a local Florida newspaper in the March 21st, 1991 edition of Florida Today, after he won a kite flying contest, and that's all it took to spark Mark Schwab's interest. He posed as a reporter who wanted to do a follow-up interview with Junny, and within weeks he groomed both Junny and his parents to trust him. Mark Dean Schwab was born on December 16, 1968 in Dover, Ohio, United States. We don't know a lot about his childhood, but it seems that Mark was raped at gunpoint by a friend's father as a child. And basically this is all I have on Mark's early childhood. I know that he had a mother, but I couldn't find any other information about his parents or even his family home life. His life of crimes started quite early on, in his teenage years, and he would always get away lightly. Either short stays in prison or released early, which is going to play a huge part in today's story. Now, I want to give a quick disclaimer here. The names of the victims, except for Junny Jr., might not be the real names to help protect their identities. Now, the first time that Mark sexually assaulted a boy was in the fall of 1986, when Mark was actually 17 years old. His victim was a younger high school sophomore called Warren. He was 14 years old. On his way to school in Brevard County, Florida, one morning, Warren walked by Mark's truck in the parking lot of a bank near the school. The hood of Mark's truck was raised. Mark asked Warren to help him start the truck whilst he fiddled with the engine. Warren jumped in the truck to try and start the engine. The truck started quite quickly, which was very odd. I assume that Mark's truck issue was just a ruse to get Warren into his truck. I suppose as a thank you for helping, Mark offered Warren a ride to school and the boy accepted, but soon realized that Mark was actually heading in the wrong direction. He was going in the opposite direction of school. As soon as Mark drove the truck out of the parking lot, he grabbed Warren's hair, pulled his head into his lap, and put a knife against his throat. He then drove the truck down some dirt roads and eventually parked it in such a way that the tree blocked the passenger door, essentially trapping Warren inside the truck. With Warren trapped inside the truck, Mark ordered him to remove his shorts, and he then began to masturbate Warren. After a few minutes, he ordered Warren to masturbate himself, and then he performed oral sex on Warren. After Mark was done, he drove Warren to the high school and threatened to kill him if he told anyone what had happened. 2 days later, as Warren was again walking to school, Mark pulled up alongside him. He gave him a $20 bill and thanked him for not telling anything to anyone. Warren never set eyes on Mark again after that, and he didn't come forward about what happened until Junny Jr. went missing, which happened 5 years after the assault on Warren. Another boy, also 14 years old, accepted a ride from a party with Mark. Mark took the boy to a secluded area, put a knife to his throat, and attempted to rape him. When the boy resisted, Mark offered him $1,000 to let him complete the act. Still struggling with his attacker, the boy was actually able to open the door and jump out of the truck. He didn't report the attempted rape until later. Mark's next sexual assault that we know of happened during the summer of 1987. This time his victim, called Tan, was a 13-year-old boy. To get his hands on Tan, Mark called him and his family, telling them that he adopted a dog that they had given to a local pet shelter, Brevard County Humane Society. He said that he needed their advice about how to care for the dog. Using that story, over the next few weeks, Mark visited Tan's home in Brevard County several times, warming himself with the family. 3 weeks after meeting Tan, Mark called him one morning and told him that he had a house painting job and he would need some help. He promised to give Tan half of the $400 that he expected to be paid for the work. Tan agreed, and later Mark picked him up, but instead of driving Tan to the painting job, Mark took him to his house. As soon as they walked into the house, Mark stuck a knife to Tan's throat. He then forced Tan to take off his clothes, bound his hands behind his back with a cord, and blindfolded him. He touched Tan's and orally molested him. He then forced the 13-year-old boy to lie on his stomach on a couch and anally raped him. The assault lasted several hours, all morning and into the afternoon. During part of it, Tan even blacked out. After he finished, Mark untied Tan, allowed him to dress, and then drove him home, like nothing even happened. He was told not to say anything to anyone and promised that he would put $200 in Tan's mailbox the next day if Tan would keep quiet. Tan had a small cut on his throat from the knife, and he also had bruises on his arms from being tied up. He reported what happened to him, and Mark was actually charged with sexual battery under Florida law. He confessed and he pleaded guilty to the sexual battery charge. That crime was punishable by a term of imprisonment for life or by a term of imprisonment not exceeding 40 years. But Mark didn't receive nearly that much punishment. Instead, on March 18, 1988, he was sentenced to only 8 years in prison. He didn't even serve his full sentence or even half of it. In early March of 1991, Mark was released from prison in Florida. His early release wasn't because he received any type of treatment, because really he hadn't. Even though he was initially accepted into a sex offender program for inmates before he could complete the screening process, that program was ended because of budget cuts. However, even without that treatment, Mark was released from prison on probation only 3 years after he was given an 8-year sentence. He was required to participate in a sexual offender therapy program as a condition of his probation. Less than a month after his release and during the same time that he was in this program, Mark found another victim. Junny Rios-Martinez Sr. was an 11-year-old boy who won a kite flying contest, which led to his picture being published in the March 21, 1991 edition of Florida Today, a local newspaper in Brevard County, Florida. The day after Junny's photograph ran in the paper, his mother Vickie received a phone call from a man identifying himself as Malcolm Denmark, saying that he was from the newspaper. The man told Vickie that he saw Junny's picture in the newspaper and wanted to interview him for another article. He called back later that day while Junny was at home and was allowed to speak with him. Junny agreed to be interviewed, and his mother Vickie and the man arranged for the interview to take place at Junny's home before Junny's baseball game the following day. The next day, which was Saturday, March 23, 1991, Mark went to Junny's home for the interview and introduced himself as Mark Dean. He explained that Denmark, his associate from Florida Today, couldn't make the interview because of a conflict, but he was prepared to conduct the interview for Denmark. Mark had a spiral notebook with handwriting on several pages, which he said were questions that Denmark prepared for the interview. But the truth is that Mark didn't actually work for any publication. He actually had a construction job and he wasn't an associate of anyone named Malcolm Denmark. But neither Junny nor his mother knew that, and they certainly didn't know that the person they let into their home was a child molester who just got out of prison. During the interview, Mark sat on a couch in the living room. Junny sat across from him in a rocking chair, and Vickie sat on the couch just a few feet away. Mark asked Junny about the things that he liked to do, his favorite subject in school, his grades, whether there were drugs in school or peer pressure, and about cars. Junny later showed Mark his baseball and surfing trophies, to which Mark told Junny's mother Vickie, "You must be very proud of him." Mark even gave Junny a gift certificate to McDonald's on which was written, quote, "To Junny from Florida Today, Mark," end of quote. After the interview was over, Mark told Vickie that he would like to interview Junny again for another potentially national story, and Junny should attend a photo shoot for the story at Florida Today's offices the next Monday. Vickie agreed and told him that he could also take photos of Junny playing drums at a club where his father worked on Sundays. Mark asked Vickie if he could go with them to Junny's baseball game that evening, telling her he just wanted to see Junny playing and get to know him and his family better. After Vickie agreed, Mark spent half an hour at Junny's baseball game that night. However, he never showed up at the club to take photos of Junny on the next Sunday when Junny was playing the drums. He instead called Vickie that night and told her that his deadline on the story got extended and the photo shoot was cancelled. The next day he called again, and this time he told Vickie that he would no longer be involved with the article for Florida Today because he took a new position with a surfing magazine. You see how clever he is? This is just typical of grooming behavior. Learning the interests of the victim and the family and their customs and their life. In this way, Mark began to exploit the information he gained about Junny's interest in surfing during his visit to their home. During the so-called interview, I think that this was meticulously planned. 2 days later, Vickie and her husband, they received a letter from Mark. And here we can actually see how he starts grooming Junny's parents as well into trusting him. In the letter, he told them that they were a special family, that their family was a special one, unlike any other he had ever met, and that he could tell all of the family members loved each other very much. The following Sunday, which was Easter, Mark personally delivered an Easter card to the family. Vickie was home alone. They both discussed the letter he sent her and her husband. She told Mark that it affected her deeply emotionally and that she was very affected by and very moved by what he wrote about her family. They also talked about the new job that Mark supposedly had. He told Vickie he had gained a lot of contacts with surfing companies and that he would like to help Junny get sponsored by one of them. He even asked her to write up a resume for Junny and to get together some pictures of him that Mark could take to his contact. Very trusting that, this man is who he says that he is, Vickie does everything that he asks of her. 3 days later, he tells her that a surfing company was interested in sponsoring Junny. Later in the week, she put together even more pictures of Junny and Mark came by the house to pick them up. He then told her he wanted to take Junny to Daytona Beach to meet people from the surfing company over the weekend. But that didn't happen because the family couldn't really make the necessary arrangements. But Mark is not giving up. Oh no, he's not giving up. The following week, he dropped by the Rios-Martinez household and told them that the surfing company which he named agreed to sponsor Junny. He even brought Junny a t-shirt with the company's logo, caps with the logo, all kind of merchandise with the logo. He told Junny that he could have whatever surfboard he wanted and he could even design it himself. He said that the company also would provide Junny with surfing clothes. Over the next several days, Mark visited the family several times. He worked with Junny on designing his surfboard and also clothes. He told Vickie that he had met with the president of the surfing company and he hand-delivered to Vickie forged documents claiming to be a sponsorship letter and contracts. He provided the family with a list of the surfing tournaments that he claimed Junny would participate in. Can you just comprehend what an elaborate plan he had? Is just unbelievable. I think that between his real construction job and his free time, he would be constantly thinking about the plan details and how far he would go. And you can even tell how far he thought of it. I'm sure that, somewhere he must have written down all of these ideas and thought about how to execute them. I can just picture him coming home from a day shift at his construction job and he starts with this idea in his head and he goes like, oh, this is another good idea. Let me just write it down. And then he keeps on doing the same things. It's just mind-blowing, really. During one of his visits with the family, Mark again asked Junny's parents if he could take Junny to Daytona Beach to meet with the surfing company. This time, they agreed. he told them that he would pick Junny up at 10 a.m. on Sunday, 14th of April 1991. That morning, however, Mark called and cancelled the trip. Vickie and Junny Sr. never heard from Mark again. And you're probably thinking, whew, that's a lovely thing, that's a really good thing, right? Well, not really, because Junny Jr. did hear from Mark again. Thursday, April 18, 1991 was just like any other school day for Junny. At around 7 a.m. he left home for his 6th grade class at Clear Lake Middle School in Brevard County. He was probably anxious about the baseball game that he was going to play later that evening. At around 2:15 p.m. that day, a bookkeeper at Junny's school received a phone call from a man claiming to be Junny's father. The man told the bookkeeper to deliver a message to Junny. Quote, "I'd like for him not to go home on the bus. I would like for him to meet me at the ball field." End of quote. Believing that the man was Junny's father, Junny Sr., the bookkeeper contacted Junny's classroom, had him sent to the office, and gave him the message. Around 3 p.m., one of Junny's schoolmates actually walked with him for a short while towards the baseball field. She saw Junny Jr. jump the fence into the baseball field. Another one of Junny's friends later saw him and a tall guy getting out of a U-Haul truck. A while later, the friend went back by the park, but the truck, the man and Junny by that point were gone. Junny's baseball game started at 6:30 p.m. on that evening. His mother, Vickie, went to the baseball field as soon as she finished work, arriving shortly after 7 p.m. But Junny wasn't there. Her husband, Junny Sr., who was also at the park, didn't see Junny either. Vickie immediately went home to check for him, but Junny wasn't there either. She even called Mark at the number that he gave her, but surprise, surprise, she was unable to reach him. Later in the evening, Vickie and her husband, Junny Sr., reported Junny Jr. as missing. Early the next morning, on April 19, Mark learned from his mother that the police went to the apartment he shared with her and wanted to question him about a missing child. About 45 minutes later, he called his mother and he told her that he was going to see his probation officer. But he didn't. Instead, in the late afternoon of the next day, April 20th, he called his aunt in Port Washington, Ohio, almost 1,000 miles away from Cocoa, Florida. Mark told his aunt that a man called Donald forced him at gunpoint to kidnap a boy named Junny. He said that Donald threatened to kill his mother if he didn't do it. He also told his aunt that Donald forced him to have sexual relations with a young boy. Now, if you remember, when Mark was a child, he was raped at gunpoint by the father of one of his friends. So is it possible that he took that as an inspiration for his story, the story that he told his aunt, and also the story that he worked extensively to keep real, as we will see later on? The next day, on April 21st, Mrs. Kinsey, who I suppose is Mark's aunt, was visited by law enforcement officers who were looking for Mark in connection with Junny's disappearance. Whilst the police was at her home, Mark called her. He called back later that day, and the officers were actually able to trace the call to a nearby town where they arrested him while he was at the payphone still talking with his aunt. The night that he was arrested, Mark willingly gave a recorded statement to law enforcement. His story is this. Brace yourselves. A man he identified as Donald confronted him outside the bar at about 2 a.m. on the Sunday before Junny disappeared, which would have been April 14, 1991, and threatened to get him put back behind bars. On Monday, April 15, Mark received a call threatening to frame him for sexually assaulting a boy unless Mark bought a motorcycle for another man. Because of those two threats, Mark rented a U-Haul truck. He said he did it to make him look less conspicuous and he checked himself into a motel in Cocoa Beach, Brevard County. I mean, you could say that there are some hints of truth in his story here, but clearly he's lying. But you know that a lie always, starts with a seed of truth, and from there it kind of develops. According to Mark's story, on Thursday, April 18, Donald attacked him at a restaurant near the motel and forced him into his car at gunpoint. What's with the gun? I don't know. Donald drove him to a field and threatened to kill his mother if he didn't do everything that he was told. Donald then drove the two of them to a payphone that Donald used to call Junny's school, pretending to be Junny's father and leaving the message that Junny should go to the baseball field after school. After making that call, Donald took Mark back to the U-Haul truck and warned him that he had better return to his motel room with some kid or else his mother was going to be dead. Mark immediately went in his U-Haul truck and picked up Junny at the baseball field. You can kind of say here that this is sort of like an embedded confession from Mark, but really he's involving an imaginary character here, Donald. Kind of like talking about himself in a third person. Mark claimed that shortly after he returned to his motel room with Junny, Donald entered the room, locked the door behind him, drew his gun and told him, "Now I got you, you son of a bitch." Donald then used duct tape to bind Junny's hands behind his back and a knife to cut Junny's clothes off of him. Donald then told Mark that he was going to have to do something to this kid sexually. When Junny started to cry, Donald struck him a couple of times and then taped his mouth shut. Donald then put his gun to the back of Mark's head and forced him to have anal intercourse with Junny. Now, remember that Mark's victim 4 years before Junny was anally raped by him, so again, kind of mixing the truth in with the lies, in my opinion. Mark also told officers that Donald forced him to leave the motel and told him not to come back for several hours. When he returned to the motel room sooner than he should have, Donald ordered him to pick up and handle a black footlocker that was in the room. Donald again forced Mark to leave. After 5 or 6 hours, Mark returned to the motel room, but Donald and Junny were gone. They were no longer there. Mark claimed that he didn't know where Junny was. The officers returned him to Florida on April 23rd, 1991. While they were traveling from the airport to the police station, Mark told one of the officers that he wanted to look for Junny's body. For several hours during that rainy afternoon and into the night, Mark directed the officers accompanying him to various locations in Brevard County. At about 10 p.m., Mark led the officers to a largely undeveloped part of the county. Once there, Mark walked down an unpaved road, stopped, began pacing around in the road, and then pointed into the woods. The search team crossed a drainage ditch and walked into the woods in the direction that Mark pointed. Not far from the road, they saw a small footlocker. The footlocker was tied nearly shut with rope and covered with palm branches and debris, which obviously had been placed there to hide it. The lid of the footlocker was slightly open and a white cloth was visible inside. Even from 10 feet away, the team could tell from the smell that a human body was inside. It was 5 days since Junny was last seen alive. The officers took the footlocker to the medical examiner's office where it was carefully examined. When the ropes tied around the footlocker were cut and the lid opened, there was a blanket that had several stains on it. Under the blanket was a small boy naked in a semi-fetal position. His face was not recognizable because of decomposition, but through fingerprints the body was identified as that of Junny Rios-Martinez Sr. Also found inside the footlocker were a pair of shoes, socks, underwear, shorts, a shirt, a watch, a yellow medal, a gold chain, 2 towels, some pieces of weighted up duct tape, and a manila folder. Junny's mother, Vickie, identified the clothing and the jewelry items as belonging to her son. Some of the clothing were the ones that she bought for him the previous Easter, and the gold chain was a family heirloom his father passed on to Junny. An autopsy determined that Junny had died from mechanical asphyxia, probably smothering or strangulation. Despite the decomposition, signs of possible bruising around the anus were detected. One of the pieces of tape that had been scrunched up in the footlocker had Mark's fingerprint on it. A search of his car led to a discovery of a receipt from a Kmart. The receipt, dated April 18, 1991, the day that Junny was abducted, showed the purchase of a footlocker. After Junny's body was found, Mark gave another statement to police officers. In this statement, he retold his story about a man named Donald forcing him to kidnap and rape Junny. But this time he added that after he had intercourse with Junny, Donald forced him and Junny, who was still alive, to get into the U-Haul that Mark rented. Donald drove them around various locations near Cocoa while discussing where he could dump Junny's body so that Mark would be blamed for his death. One of those locations was near where Junny's body was found. Donald then returned Mark to the motel and told him to get lost and not to come back for several hours. When Mark returned the next morning, he saw Donald carrying the black footlocker, which Donald handed to Mark. He then ordered Mark to leave again. According to Mark's extra story that he gave to police after he returned to the motel a few hours later, Donald forced him into his car and drove him out to where the footlocker was. He ordered Mark to walk into the woods where he spotted the footlocker. Donald then returned him to the motel and threatened him for the last time. The next day, he drove to Ohio. The state trial court judge, after hearing all of the evidence at a bench trial and sentence hearing, rejected Mark's story about another man being involved and found that Mark acted alone. Mark planned things so that Junny Jr. left the baseball field thinking he was with a trusted friend, and once in the motel room he physically overpowered 11-year-old Junny Jr. He bound his hands with duct tape, his mouth and part of his face. He took a knife and violently cut off the clothes, leaving Junny naked, crying and terrified. He then punched him twice in the stomach. He put bed linen or mattress cover over his head. Junny was so scared that he started to shake. Mark anally raped him. Junny was conscious the whole time, which lasted a substantial amount of time. He continued to cry throughout, stopping only when Mark finally strangled or smothered him to death. A few days before the brutal assault of Junny, Mark had attended a group therapy session as part of the sexual offender program that was a condition of his probation. On May 15, 1991, Mark appeared in a state court in Brevard County, pleading not guilty to charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping a child under age 13, and sexual assault of a child under age 13. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. Mark and his defense counsel made a strategic decision to waive a jury. He was convicted on May 22, 1992. After a week-long trial, the trial judge convicted Mark on all counts as charged. On July 1, 1992, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Junny and given 2 life sentences for the kidnapping and sexual battery of a child under the age of 13. In addition, his probation was revoked on the previous conviction and he was resentenced to an additional life sentence, giving him a total of 3 life sentences. Dr. Fred Berlin, a psychiatrist who was head of the sex offender program at Johns Hopkins University, interviewed Mark in October 1991. Dr. Berlin diagnosed him as having a paraphiliac disorder which consisted of sexual paraphilia and sexual sadism. This disorder caused him to find that young males are a powerful sexual sexual attraction and to become even more aroused if humiliation and pain are involved. In Dr. Berlin's opinion, Mark's disorder was a serious psychiatric illness that was not due to any voluntary decision on his part. Dr. Howard Bernstein, a licensed psychologist who also evaluated Mark, testified for him at sentencing. Dr. Bernstein found absolutely no evidence that Mark had any psychosis, formal thought disorder, major mood disorder, or any other mental disorder. Instead, he found Mark to be rational and realistic when interviewed, but added that his social judgment and thinking is clearly impaired within a very narrow range of interests and concerns, and that's the sexual concern. He described Mark as being preoccupied with sexual concerns and profoundly driven by these cravings, and as having immature judgment at the very least. Dr. Bernstein also believed that Mark likely used what he described as false memories in order to justify his inappropriate sexual behavior and to blame others for it. Dr. Bernstein explained that Mark's acting out sexually likely began as a fantasy that gives arousal, during which Mark becomes fixated on a victim who fits his sexual predilection. Younger boys, same gender, smaller stature. In order to fulfill his obsessive sexual preoccupation, Mark takes a ritualistic approach involving pre-planning and schemed events. His fantasy is fueled by his excitement and arousal, as well as by aggression and control. Mark contemplates only the positive consequences of his actions: orgasm, satisfaction, completion, authority, revenge. In order to justify acting on his fantasy, Mark must distort real events to justify his behavior to reduce his guilt. According to Dr. Bernstein, after Mark's pre-planning and scamming phase, there is hyper-aggressiveness marked by increased physiologic arousal and sexual excitement. He begins to transfer his fantasies to a real victim, and that leads to the next stage, victim-seeking behavior. Once he locates a victim that meets his fantasy, he begins a fantasy rehearsal process. The mode of gratification used by Mark is sex, humiliation, and sadism. It's at this point that Mark actually loses control. His fantasy becomes an irresistible impulse and he has an incapacity to stop. He rationalized, minimized, and ultimately denied the possibility of any negative consequences from his action and gave himself permission for the assault. The conclusion of this process is for Mark to act out his fantasized sexual aggression. Under cross-examination, Dr. Bernstein acknowledged that Mark had been able to control his desire for the several weeks during which he attempted to lure Junny away from his parents. He was also rational in understanding that he would not be able to fulfill his desires unless he succeeded in being alone with Junny. Dr. Bernstein testified that Mark's disorder likely progressed from the time of the crime involving Tan to the later one involving Junny. Being punished for the 1987 crime against Tan may have taught Mark that in order to fulfill his desires while protecting himself from punishment, he needed to kill his victim. Dr. Bernstein was of the opinion that Mark knew that he was ill, he exhibited signs of guilt about his victims, and he was in constant turmoil about it. However, he also described Mark as egocentric and perhaps narcissistic, stating that he wanted to use people for his own pleasure. Overall, Dr. Bernstein summed up Mark as damaged goods, a sick child with sexually disordered behavior in an adult body, and certainly dangerous by history. In his opinion, Mark showed a low potential for change and was one for whom rehab programs are unlikely to succeed. Dr. William R. Saymak, a clinical psychologist specializing in treating sexual offenders and sexual victims testified as a rebuttal witness for the prosecution. Dr. Jayme disputed Dr. Bernstein's conclusion that Mark's sexual desires became irresistible impulses which he could not control. In Dr. Jayme's view, such impulses can be resisted if there is sufficient motivation to stop. He believed that Mark's known assaults showed a progression and that he had learned each time to do things better, more carefully and slicker. Dr. Jayme believed that Mark is not a pedophile, but that he has an antisocial personality disorder and is a rape murderer and mentally disordered sex offender. As a result, Mark would have been more difficult to treat than your average pedophile. Dr. Jayme concluded that it is highly unlikely that he could be successfully rehabilitated and be safe without a lot of controls around him. Dr. Jayme noted that Mark's offenses were very cool, calm and carefully planned, that he went well beyond what is needed to rape or even to molest a kid, and he went to extreme lengths to seduce and charm the family. Dr. Jayme found this last point notable because most child molesters choose victims who are easily molestable. He testified that Mark's choice of good kids from good families who are happy reflects his own resentment that he didn't have a nice family, and that Mark gets back at his victims by destroying them. Dr. Jayme also based his conclusion that Mark is not treatable on the fact that he exhibited a tremendous amount of remorse while in prison, but that didn't stop his behavior when he got out. On March 23rd, 1992, 2 months before Mark's trial was set to begin, a letter addressed to one of his court-appointed attorneys at the public defender's office was delivered to that office. The letter was opened by a secretary and examined by the executive director of the office, 2 attorneys and 2 investigators. The author of the letter, which was handwritten, said that his name was Doug. In the letter, Doug claimed that he should have killed Mark like he planned. The letter indicated that Doug knew Mark had told the police about Doug committing the crime. But actually, Mark told the police about Donald committing the crime. But apparently, as the letter writer was concerned, the two were, one and the same. Which I'm guessing that Mark forgot his own lie about the name, because Mark ratted him out to the police. Doug threatened in the letter to abduct, torture and kill one of Junny's younger brothers. The letter didn't explain how Doug or Donald knew what Mark told the officers. On March 25th, 1992, 2 days after receiving the letter, the public defender's office informed the police about it, and the next day the letter was handed over to law enforcement. Afterwards, the letter was tested and found to have Mark's fingerprints on it. On April 20th, 1992, attorneys from the public defender's office had been representing Mark in the case for nearly a year. On that date, one of them filed a motion requesting that the entire office be allowed to withdraw from further representation. The stated grounds were that the prosecution planned to use the Doug letter against Mark at trial, and employees of the public defender's office would be called as witnesses to testify about the chain of custody of the letter. The motion admitted that the Doug letter had been received by the public offender's office on March 23rd, handled by 6 employees at the office, and given to law enforcement 3 days after it was received. At a hearing on the motion to withdraw, Mark's chief trial counsel argued that he could not effectively cross-examine any of his co-workers at the public defender's office to test their credibility because of his professional and personal relationships with them. Counsel also refused to stipulate to the chain of custody of the letter, even though no factual basis for contesting it had ever been suggested. The trial court denied the motion to withdraw. The state called 5 members of the public defender's office to testify to the chain of custody of the letter. Mark's trial counsel insisted that he could not cross-examine them, and so he didn't. The trial judge questioned two of the witnesses after the prosecution concluded its examination of each of them. The judge asked the first witness, a secretary with the public defender's office, about her job duties, how mail is processed at the public defender's office, what she did with the letter after she opened it, what the letter looked like and whether she read it, whether the copy of the letter introduced into evidence was the same as she remembered it, whether anyone else had come into contact with the letter while it was under her control, and whether she had personal knowledge of who wrote the letter. None of her answers actually helped the defense. The judge asked the second witness, also a secretary, whether she had personal knowledge of who wrote the letter, whether she had read it or changed or altered it, whether the copy used at trial was the same as she remembered it, and whether she was acting in the normal course of business in handling the letter. None of her answers either helped the defense in any way. On direct appeal, Mark argued that he had been denied effective assistance of counsel because his attorneys were placed in the unenviable position of discharging their duty of advocacy on behalf of their client at the risk of perhaps alienating those persons with whom they work on a daily basis. Without addressing the performance question, the district court denied the claim because Mark had not shown that he was prejudiced by his counsel's failure to cross-examine and attack the credibility of the witnesses from the public defender's office. The court's reasoning was that those witnesses merely provided testimony regarding the chain of custody of the letter, which was not in dispute. The motion to withdraw laid out all of the relevant facts regarding the chain of custody of the letter: when and where it was received, to whom it was addressed, who opened it, who else possessed it or handled it, and when it was turned over to the police. Mark's counsel set out those facts in the motion because they were not subject to dispute on any reasonable basis. There was not much else for any of the five witnesses to say on the subject other than to attest that the letter had not been altered since leaving their possession, which they did. As the state trial court, the Florida Supreme Court, and the district court observed, the chain of custody of the letter was essentially undisputed. Mark had the burden of affirmatively proving prejudice, and aided by new counsel, he still didn't. He still didn't suggest any evidence for attacking either the chain of custody or the credibility of the five employees of the public defender's office who testified to it. Mark has not shown that the letter's authenticity legitimately could have been called into question and ruled inadmissible if only his counsel had cross-examined the chain of custody witnesses. Another issue covered by the certificate of appealability concerns Mark's waiver of trial by jury, which he claimed was not knowingly and intelligently made. The Florida Supreme Court held that the claim was procedurally barred. The district court recognized and enforced the procedural bar. The only cause Mark has asserted for his failure to raise this claim is ineffective assistance of counsel, but as the district court pointed out, he failed to establish that the assistance his counsel rendered in this respect was ineffective. The final issue covered in the appeal was Mark's claim that in sentencing him, the trial court committed constitutional error in its mitigating circumstance findings. The Florida Supreme Court actually rejected this claim on direct appeal. Mark contended that the mitigating circumstance findings were based on incorrect findings of the fact he has not carried his burden of establishing that the decision of this claim was based on an unreasonable determination of the facts in light of the evidence presented in the state court proceeding. The claim also appeared to attack the trial court's conclusions that some facts or circumstances were not mitigating. In that respect, it runs counter to a number of decisions recognizing that while sentencing courts may not refuse to consider evidence offered in mitigation, They need not decide that the facts established by that evidence have mitigating force in the context of the case. The impact of the facts on Junny's case on the sentencing judge's decision and his opinion about the relative weight of the aggravating and mitigating circumstances were conveyed by the order he entered and the findings he made. In explaining why the heinous, atrocious or cruel aggravating circumstance factor applied, he said, quote, "It is impossible for this court to contemplate another crime that would be more heinous, atrocious and cruel than the death of Junny Rios-Martinez. The terror of the abduction and rape, followed by the slow death of strangulation or suffocation, was extreme." In addition to finding that the especially heinous circumstances applied, the court also found as aggravating circumstances that Mark previously had been convicted of another capital felony or one involving the use or threat of violence, and that the murder was committed during the course of kidnapping and sexual battery. The court not only concluded that the aggravating circumstances outweighed the mitigating ones, but the court also found that any one of the three aggravating circumstances outweighs all mitigating circumstances. There is no possibility that any error the judge may have made in describing the evidence offered in mitigation or in discussing the circumstances proven by that evidence had any effect or influence on his sentencing decision, much less a substantial and injurious one. In 1997, Mark served a 6-month institutional adjustment for a positive drug test. His final appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States was denied on January 16, 1997. After being sentenced, he was housed at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. On December 15, 2006, Governor Jeb Bush suspended all pending executions until further notice after the execution of Angel Neve's death had taken much longer than usual. This ban was lifted when the new governor of Florida, Charlie Crist, signed Mark's death warrant on July 18, 2007. He was then transferred to Florida State Prison. He was scheduled for execution by means of lethal injection on November 15, 2007 at 6 p.m. However, federal judge N.C. Conway granted a stay of execution on November 14.
16 years, a Brevard County family has waited to see the man who murdered their son executed. Now they say it's time to move on. As West 2's Amanda Ober reports, the family held a celebration of the young victim's life, but didn't talk about the man who took it away.
This celebration of the life of 11-year-old Junny Rios-Martinez was intended to come after the execution of convicted child killer Mark Dean Schwab. Schwab raped and murdered Rios-Martinez in 1991 and was sentenced to death. But just Thursday, his execution was stayed. For Junny's family, the news was painful.
It's too bad they don't have a constitutional amendment that covers cruel and unusual punishment for victims, because it certainly has been very cruel and unjust.
The Rios-Martinez family says after 16 years of waiting for what they consider justice, they can't wait any longer. So they decided to close the book on their ordeal and said this celebration will mark the end of this chapter in their own lives.
We need to have closure. We have things we want to do. We have a life we want to live, and we don't want to play the role of victims in this drama any longer.
Saturday's event was held in a Cocoa Park that's been named after Junny, and dozens paid tribute to the little boy's legacy. Junny's death has affected untold lives, especially through legislation passed in his name that prevents sex offenders from getting an early release.
There are thousands and thousands of children in this state who don't have terrible stories in their past because of the actions of this beautiful family.
To symbolize that they finally found peace, Junny's family released dozens of white birds, even though the justice they desire in their hearts has not yet come. As for Junie's killer, Mark Schwab, he remains on Florida's death row. The U.S. Supreme Court likely won't rule on the issue of lethal injections until at least next spring, and it's not expected there will be any executions before then.
On November 15th, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the execution can proceed, but the United States Supreme Court blocked the execution later that same day, pending appeals of 2 Kentucky inmates challenging the combination of the 3 drugs used for lethal injection, which is the same combination as is used in Florida. The Supreme Court upheld Kentucky's death penalty on April 16, 2008 by a vote of 7-2. The governor of Florida, Christ, signed a new death warrant for Mark the next day without a date for execution. On May 19th, the Supreme Court specifically denied his appeal, permitting the governor to reschedule his execution. Mark made one final appeal to the Florida Supreme Court on June 25th, but was denied because the claims being made were the same ones that had already been declined by the Supreme Court. Mark Schwab was executed by lethal injection on July the 1st, 2008 and pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m.
Only 2 hours left to live unless he gets a last-minute stay. Schwab raped and murdered 11-year-old Junny Rios-Martinez of Cocoa in 1991. He will be the first death row inmate to be executed since December 2006, when Angel Diaz took 34 minutes to die. Big stories get big coverage tonight. We have team coverage beginning with West 2's Bob Keeling. Bob.
Hey, Sian, yes, Mark Dean Schwab started what could be his last day with a final meal of fried eggs, bacon, sausage, hash browns, and toast, along with a quart of chocolate milk. Department of Corrections officials say he has been waiting calmly in his death watch cell, and he also gave them a clear indication if he will apologize or, for that matter, say anything at all to the family of his victim, Junny Rios-Martinez.
16 years to the day he was sentenced to death for the rape and murder of 11-year-old Junny Rios-Martinez. Mark Dean Schwab told Florida State Prison officials he will not give any last words.
I asked him if he planned to give a last statement. He said he did not.
Corrections officers say Schwab has visited with his mother, an aunt, and a spiritual advisor. He's waiting calmly just steps from where the lethal injection is due to be administered.
It's the execution chamber, and then behind that are our cells, death watch cells, and he is in one of the death watch cells.
Prison officials will keep an open phone line until 6 p.m. and ask if there are any stays before the chemical cocktail is administered, which will end Schwab's life. His attorneys argued to the U.S. Supreme Court today that the prison system in Florida still is not able to administer the chemicals correctly. They disagree.
We're confident. We've held, our procedures have been in place since last July. We've held numerous trainings. The execution team has been training. They train not only for a normal execution, but for any contingencies that might arise, even things such as power failure.
Now, the Department of Corrections spokesperson says they can accommodate around 10 to 12 members of Junny's family, who we are expecting up here to witness the execution. We're also expecting some anti-death penalty protesters to gather about 100 yards from us, but so far we have not seen any. As for right now, things seem to be going smoothly.
Mark had a final visit with his mother Thursday, but he refused to eat his final meal of buttered toast, bacon, eggs, sausage links, hash browns, and the chocolate milk that he had ordered. Junny Jr.'s mother, Vickie Rios-Martinez, was unhappy with the Supreme Court's action and her family's 16-year wait for justice. Junny's justice came only 19 years later in the form of a lethal injection. For Junny's family, daily life can still be a struggle. To get by, they've chosen to focus on happy times, on their family, and the belief that Junny still watches over them. Quote, "Some days are easier than others. You could be driving across the causeway and see a beautiful sunset or sunrise and just wish that he was here to enjoy it with you. And he is. He always lets us know he's here," Vickie said. There are pictures of Junny everywhere in the couple's Cocoa home. His surfboard is displayed for everyone to see. Quote, "He loved surfing and the salt air and just being out in nature," Junny Sr. said. "I think he would have been a great dad. He had a good soul. The family went through countless of appeals, hearings, stays of executions, interviews, and each one brought the horror of April 18, 1991 right back for them. But they wouldn't have preferred life without possibility of parole for Mark, their son's killer. Junny's dad said, quote, "No, I would have had no problem whatsoever causing serious damage and squeezing the last breath from him myself," end of quote. Junny Sr. once had a rifle aimed at the prison van as Mark was being delivered to court, but he never fired because he was scared of hurting the Brevard County Sheriff's deputies escorting Mark. Vickie said, quote, "I have to say, I didn't believe in the death penalty before losing Junny. I didn't believe in killing anybody or anything, but that was one of those belief systems that I had to learn to change because our system had already put him out when he should have already been sentenced to 2 life sentences," end of quote. Her experience witnessing the execution was different from her husband's. Quote, "I just wanted to be able to look into his eyes and let him know that I forgave him because I wasn't going to carry this with me for the rest of my life, and he robbed me of that," she said. But Mark never looked up from the gurney. Vickie found herself contrasting how her 11-year-old son died with how Mark died. Quote, "The procedure was very, very peaceful. His eyes shut, his jaw went slack, and he never woke up again. There was no suffering for Mark Schwab," she said. "We give a convict this peaceful passage. It wasn't scary. He didn't have to face us because when the curtain opened between the death chamber and the gallery, Mark was already sedated and strapped to the gurney. The whole thing was over in less than 15 minutes. If you were the victim of that man, you would face him and look into his eyes at the very last moment. You know, the eyes are the soul. They robbed us of looking into his soul. Maybe he would have wanted to say something to us," Vickie said. After they found Junny's naked body in a footlocker, carelessly thrown into a drainage ditch, there was a trial. Mark was found guilty and sentenced to death. And then the penalty phase was drawn out by appeal after appeal for a decade and a half. During that time, Vickie and her family grieved and tried to heal and prayed for justice. "We discovered there is only one page in all the law books for victims' family," Vickie said. "All the rest of that law book stuff is for protection of the criminals." So Vickie took it upon herself to add some pages to the Florida law book. She and her family won the passage of the Junny Rios-Martinez Sr. Act of 1992, which prohibits those convicted of sexual battery from receiving early release. Vickie Rios-Martinez lost her beloved aunt and her father, and she wishes that they would have had such a peaceful way to leave this earth. "We give it to the criminal," she says again, "but not to the suffering. Nothing for the victim." Most couples who've lost a child in this manner don't stay together, but Junny Sr. and Vickie are still together even though both say it hasn't been easy. The biggest question you ask yourself over and over again is why me? Why Junny? Why our family? Why, Vickie said. And no one else can answer those questions for you. Nobody. I went searching for answers and I went searching how to live with it. It's deep and it's dark and it's lonely and it's hard to get out of. But you don't have to live in that sorrow and that deep grief. They both go to their happy place for comfort on those dark days that still happen.
I'm engagement editor John A. Torres, and it's hard to believe that it's been nearly 30 years since a bright-eyed, smiling 11-year-old boy by the name of Junny Rios-Martinez was murdered by a pedophile released from prison just 1 month earlier. I got to know Junny's family well, and I've stayed in contact with them over the years. I recently stopped by just to check on them. And while they still have some rough days, it's nothing short of a miracle that they have stayed together all this time and remain in a loving, nurturing marriage. How did they do it? Well, the key, according to Junny, is to surround yourself with the things you love. And for him, that's his family and his music. For his wife, it's also family, but it's also learning how to meditate and channel her emotions in the poetry that she loves to write. I'm engaged.
For Vickie, it's a newfound love of meditation and the poems she's been writing for years. For Junny Sr., it's always been about the music. A former professional percussionist, he acquired a new set of bongos that was used on a Santana album. Surround yourself with what you love, he said, and do more of what you love. I love my music. He was a great kid, man, and not because he was my son, Junny Sr. said. And if it happened to him, it could happen to anyone, and we just have to stay aware. There are several days throughout the year that are a bit tough for Junny and his family. Father's Day is one of them. Father's Day sometimes is solemn because Jay and I were very close, but you know, my son and my daughter, they make up for it. They make me feel very special, he said. We always have Junny on our minds. He's always present. Children and grandchildren from his and his wife's first marriages do all they can to make the day special as well. The grandchildren in particular have helped ease the pain of two other important dates. A grandson was born on Junny's birthday, May the 6th, and the granddaughter was born on April 18, the day Junny was killed. It's like Junny is telling us, I don't want you to suffer or hurt or make it a solemn day, so I'm going to give you a grandchild so you can celebrate their life, he said. Junny's surfboards are still on display in the loft alongside his father's drums, electric piano and other musical instruments. Junny's face lights up when he remembers the time his son took his place on stage while he took a break without his knowledge. He believed that another professional drummer had taken his spot. He remembers excitedly the trips to the Merritt Island airport with 3-year-old Junny to inspect all the planes, chat with the pilots, and even go up in the single-engine planes and see the Space Coast from a different view. Quote, Father's Day is very special, but I think of him all the time, end of quote. A park was dedicated to the memory of Junny Rios-Martinez, located in North Cocoa. The Junny Rios-Martinez Park has 5.96 acres with 2 pavilions, restrooms, tennis court, basketball court, volleyball court, partially shaded playground, picnic tables, and they are also looking to add a splash pad and another pavilion. This is the park where Junny's family still gather to celebrate Junny's life. Junny's mother, Vickie, still fights for justice for victims of pedophiles. According to a Facebook group and a post from August 2020, this is what she said. Many of you may have been aware of my absence from Facebook on all of my accounts, but please don't take my silence as not being awake and aware. Over the past 29 years, I have been investigating pedo, sexual abuse and trafficking missing children. Now that evidence and arrests have been made, with many more to come, it was made it all so clear why I was not able to make the changes that our children needed. The ones in official positions are the pedo ring that runs deep and wide all over the globe in plain sight and under our feet. Now it is time for those of you who are not aware to wake up for the children's sake. For myself, this is not a political issue to debate, although it involves many elites and politicians who run our world and make our policies. Keep in mind, children don't vote and don't pay taxes. Therefore, their voices does not count. Since the MSM is withholding and trying to cover up, I will continue to share my findings and disclosures. Just a warning from a mother who has lost her son to a pedo: if it breaks your heart or brings a tear when you think of what happened to little Junny, just know that there are children out there still missing and suffering. They need our voice, end of quote. And with this, we got to the end of today's video, and this is the tragic case of Junny Rios-Martinez Jr. Please do let me know what do you guys think in the comment section down below. First of all, I want to say that as for Mark's story, the one with Donald and then Doug and the letter to the attorney's office, I don't buy the story, and obviously the jury didn't buy the story either. But as you heard, only reading out loud his story, you can just hear that is not real, that it just doesn't make any sense. It's like a childish story who children just come up with to kind of, you know, get out of trouble. And as you know, most of the times children, we can usually catch them in lies, can't we? Because obviously they are children, they are more innocent than adults are, and of course, even if they try to lie, most of the times, you know, they don't know how to lie properly, so they don't get caught. And that's the feeling that I got from Mark's story. It just didn't seem plausible at all. It just didn't. And there are just so many things. I mean, the first time he said that Donald, you know, forced him to abduct Junny. Then he took the police officers to the place where Junny's body was in the food locker. Then obviously he was thinking to himself, oh, you know what, I didn't tell police this side of the story with the food locker, so now that I took the police to the body of Junny, now I need to come up with another story as to how I knew about the food locker and the location of the body, right? And then he adds another statement to his original story that it was Donald who forced him to buy the food locker, forced him to put Junny in the food locker, and then he forced him to drive Junny and dispose of his body in the place where he was discovered at. So again, you know, it's kind of like making up the story as he goes. As we all know, when someone tells the truth, obviously their story will always stay the same. There won't be any changes. There might be things that you remember after, but generally the story will always be the same. And then we got to the letter which was sent to the attorney's office, allegedly from Doug, which said that he was the one who killed Junny, and Mark ratted him out to the police, and he was feeling sorry that he didn't kill Mark as well as Junny. And of course, that who else could have known about that, right, in the letter, because it was a story made up by Mark. So I think that somehow Mark managed to get the letter out to the attorney's office to try again and show the trial or the investigation that indeed there is someone else who is actually responsible for Junny's death. But of course, he forgot the name, right? Because when you lie, you kind of forget all of your lies. So I think that, in my opinion, he forgot the name that he used in the first story to police officers. He forgot that he said Donald, and in the letter he said that he is Doug. So yeah, you know, this kind of things, it just didn't seem plausible. And at the end, it took 19 years altogether for Junny's family to finally get justice for Junny, which is just horrendous. It's just horrendous, honestly. 19 years. Can you just imagine living with that grief and not being able to have closure for 19 years, hearing appeals after appeals after appeals and so on, then execution, then delayed execution, blocked execution. It was just, whew, oh my god, I felt really sorry for Junny's family. And yes, unfortunately, this is the tragic story of Junny Rios-Martinez Jr. Again, I'm gonna say, please do let me know what do you guys think in the comment section down below. Also, if you are interested in any of the makeup that I use for today's look, all of the products are linked in the description down below under this video. Thank you for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!